What do you do when things just don't go right with your orchid growing hobby? Stay tuned and watch me review several of the orchids in my collection that are having some difficulties and what we're going to do about it. Hello, this is Dana and welcome to the Orchid Hut. Thank you for joining me today for this video, about orchid things that just aren't going like they should. Now, I'm going to be sharing with you 6 or 7 different orchids in my collection today. Each one has a little bit, unique circumstance, different things that it has been through. They've all been added to my collection at different times. Some I've had for a while, some not for very long. But in any case, every once in a while you kind of have to look through your collection and identify places where things aren't going right, and then come up with a solution, and unfortunately, in some cases, maybe just throw the orchid out. So we're going to start today actually with 2 orchids that were in my bay window because I had decided this year to grow my Latoria type dendrobiums in my bay window. And lo and behold, 2 of them, the same 2 that had had spider mites previously, were showing signs of having a new infestation of spider mites. Well, I hurried up and I pulled them out. I took them outside into a shaded location, treated them with neem oil, actually even gave them a few showers of water outside, retreated with neem oil several times. Well, and I guess the long and short of it is that, I don't want those kinds of orchids in my bay window. And as, I was thinking about it, it's possible that the first infestation of spider mites for those 2 orchids was never really cured. And whether it was the old infestation coming back or a new one, it doesn't really matter. I don't want that in the house, and it's possible that these 2 orchids will actually do better outside if they're prone to that, because there are predators of spider mites outdoors. They would get a shower of rain from time to time to clean off things like that. So, maybe my idea of growing those 2 in the house is not the best for them. So they've been outside for a while. I'll insert a still photo here so you can kind of remember what those 2 Latoria type dendrobiums looked like. And I will put a link in the upper right hand corner of the screen if you would like to watch the videos on those 2 orchids that I made previously with the spider mites. Okay, so the second orchid that I will insert a still photo for is my very sad looking vanilla planifolia. It really just did not respond well to the numerous days of intensive heat that we had during the middle of the summer. And it's just looking really, really sad. And, if I compare it to it growing outside last year, it thrived. And I think just that extra 10 degrees of heat that we had for such a prolonged period really did it in. So you can see that it's very wilted. And I think what I will do with this one is I'm going to try to take just some clippings of it and try to get it to start a root system, maybe just in some water, inside the house where it's a bit cooler, or maybe inside the orchid hut where it's a bit cooler and shadier. But it may be that I completely lose this orchid, and we'll have to start over with that one at some point if I choose to do that. Okay, so that's the 2 that are, or rather the 3 orchids that are outside that have had some difficulty. And, I kind of have a plan for what I'm going to try to do to either get them in a better growing environment, or, just try to salvage something, for that orchid. And now what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the orchids that are in front of the camera. And just as before, if these orchids had a previous video I will put a link in the upper right hand corner so that you can see what happened earlier. Okay, so we're going to start with, let's go ahead and just start with this one. This one is Encyclia, I think recently renamed to Prosthecia. I'll show you the tag. I have shown this one in videos previously, although it was probably mixed in with other orchids. But this is the one where it was mounted on this cork bark, and I could tell that this deterioration of the cork bark and probably some wood ant eating away of the cork bark, you know, this has really disintegrated here. So the root system was not able to attach, was not able to thrive. Every time this orchid put out a new growth, it would fail, and it was not putting on any kind of new roots. So I removed it from here, and I have been keeping it in a little container of wet sphagnum moss for a while, maybe now 8 weeks or so. And there are still no new growths that look like they are doing much of anything. And it's just really just kind of stagnant. It has lost some of the leaves from the tops of the old pseudobulbs. You know, this root system is for the most part dead, even though I've been keeping the sphagnum moss moist. And while it hasn't, you know, completely shriveled and died, I don't hold out a lot of hope for this. So my last ditch effort here is I'm going to go ahead and pot this up with a lot of sphagnum and some small orchid bark. And I'm going to go ahead and put it back outside in the shade where it's a bit warmer. And I'm going to see if any kind of growth, you know, wants to take off here. There may be just the tiniest little bud right here by my finger, but it doesn't really look all that promising. Now, this orchid I've had in my collection for 7 or 8 years. It has never bloomed for me, never ever. So if I lose this one, you know, not the end of the world. I'm going to give it one more chance to kind of pick up and grow. But, you know, if it doesn't, then this one will probably just be going in the trash, unfortunately. And sometimes, you know, that happens. Okay, so next up. Now, this orchid was featured in a previous video. It's a Cattleya type orchid. And it had a great root system when I repotted it, but then it tipped out of the pot and it was all downhill from there. The root system began to die. There wasn't enough of a root system to support the growth, and so I put it in this cup of damp sphagnum. I've also had it in an enclosed plastic bag to retain kind of some extra humidity and moisture in there. But really the only root that is functioning at all is this root right here. So this is not enough to take in enough water to support the plant. So the leaves, of course, have continued to shrivel, although not completely dead. It has lost some leaves like this prior to today. And again, another orchid that I don't hold out much hope for. Now, I think what I will be doing with this one, I'm going to give it just the tiniest bit more time to see if it can get into a new growth cycle, either with a new pseudobulb or some new roots. And so I'm going to continue to keep this moist and in a bag, and I will give it maybe a couple of more months to try and show if it's going to do something. And then if not, this one is probably also going to go in the trash. But, you know, sometimes you just have to say, well, I can replace this orchid. It would be less frustration for me if I just buy a new healthy specimen, and then I can actually enjoy growing it and watching it bloom. For me, I have to honestly admit that these sort of severe rescue situations are not the part of orchid growing or part of the hobby that I actually enjoy. I enjoy my orchids that do well, that thrive, that don't have a lot of problems, and of course the ones that bloom for me. But when we get into situations like this where we're trying to save something that's on its way out, and it's like in orchid ICU, that's not the part of the hobby that I particularly enjoy. So I'm going to give this one a tiny bit more time, and then, if it doesn't pick up, out it goes. All right, and then these next two are just orchids that are just, behaving in a way that's a little bit frustrating. So this is my Dendrobium Little Sweet Scent. I have done numerous videos on this orchid, particularly at this same time last year, because last year it did really, really well. It grew this great big long cane, and it had some other canes here that it grew, and I followed what I thought was correct for winter resting, but then, I had no blooms, and what I had instead was this explosion of keikis along the last year's growth. And now, of course, you can see, because it is so humid outside in my environment, these keikis have some astounding roots on them. But then this year, okay, so again, this was, I think, a very bizarre growing season. And I can see the effects of the bizarre growing season on several of my orchid plants. So there was really only one main growth this year, and it's this growth right here. And you can see that it's only half the length of the cane that was grown in the previous year. And you can tell that the growth is over because the terminal leaf is right here at the end of this year's cane growth. And it only really put out this one cane. It has some of the little fuzzy growths down here, but they didn't really turn into much. And so even though my care has been the same as last year, I do feel like the start of the growing season was delayed this year. We went from winter to summer with 110 degrees Fahrenheit, within a matter of like 4 weeks. And then, I don't know, it was too hot possibly. Maybe this one was difficult to keep it watered. I, do not know. But I do think our very bizarre growing season has contributed to this. So this cane really isn't even developed enough, to kind of like hang down. And so, I will attempt to do the winter resting thing like I did last year. Maybe, make a few minor adjustments to what I did. But again, I feel like I'm sort of going into the fall season with a plant that is not going to cooperate to have any kind of blooms when the spring rolls around. So, so it goes. The plant is healthy. It's just not behaving like I would want it to. All right. And then the last one. Now, this is a little tiny Phalaenopsis orchid. My husband was sweet enough just to pick it up for me. It had a really pretty bloom when he purchased it. It needs to be repotted in the worst way because it's in this awful flimsy plastic pot with some not so great smelling sphagnum moss down in there, so I've been watering it very carefully, but it still has an okay root system. But as with a lot of Phalaenopsis orchids that you can just buy, I guess, when they have been imported in a massive kind of way, they sometimes they have problems, and so you have to be kind of careful which specimens you pick out. And this particular orchid had a new leaf growing from the top of the plant, but as it was developing, it was also turning black. So I knew there was something wrong. And so I treated the whole plant with hydrogen peroxide. I treated the whole plant with neem oil, not knowing exactly what was causing that new growth to turn black. And that particular leaf died and fell out. But then as I watched the plant, it did not look like the problem was spreading to the stem. So that was good. I never did notice any black or discoloration further down in the stem of the plant. But because that new growth died back, this plant now no longer has the ability to grow from the crown of this any longer. Okay, this is static now. This is not going to be able to put on any more new leaves from here because that main lead leaf turned black and fell away. So what this plant is doing now is it's putting on what we call a basal growth. Now, this is different than a keiki that you will find on a bloom spike for a Phalaenopsis. This is a basal growth, and it's kind of like a pup, but not exactly, because the basal growth on a Phalaenopsis orchid is not meant to be separated ever from the mother plant. So what will happen now is that these two will grow side by side, and this one has the capability to put on new leaves from the top of the plant, whereas this one now does not. And so this is just the orchid's way of figuring out how to survive by putting a basal growth from the bottom of the plant. Absolutely nothing wrong with it. This one can, bloom in the future as soon as, there's a little bit more maturing of this new growth. And it's possible that this older part of the plant will bloom again as well. We'll just have to wait and see. All right, so these are my orchids in distress. These are my plans for these orchids, as we kind of move into the fall months. And if you enjoyed this video or learned something new, please give it a thumbs up. The subscribe button will be coming up in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen. Thanks so much for joining me, and talk to you next time.